Hyperion needs no introduction other than to say, rest in peace, Dan Simmons, an incredibly influential, inventive, and prolific sci-fi author. The Priest's Tale is a reread for me. I read Hyperion a few years ago. More than anything else in the book, this is the one that stuck with me. And I think that's a pretty much universal takeaway. The Priest's Tale and the Scholar's Tale are definitely the standouts. The Scholar's Tale is more sort of emotionally poignant, but the Priest's Tale is downright horrifying. I've never read anything quite like this in terms of the specific horror register that it's in and the use of the religious themes. There are a lot of priest in space books, and there are a lot of science fiction books that use religious themes. In fact, all of the great science fiction stories use religious themes, from Dune to Halo, even ones that are explicitly critical of religion, like Blind Sight by Peter Watts, for instance, have to use these themes because they're a deep, fundamental part of human existence, and you can't write a great story without them. So I was thinking about this HBO show from a few years ago called Raised by Wolves, which was the most sort of brazenly strange sci-fi story that I'd seen in a really long time. Maybe supplanted by Severance, but I'm not really sure. But either way, HBO, for whatever reason, took the show. They not only canceled the show, they took it off streaming services, so you can't watch it. You can't buy it anywhere. There's no way to watch this show legally anymore. But it had some similar things in common with The Priest's Tale, so it made me want to go back and read it as I was thinking about this TV show. And outside of seeing like a few YouTube videos, I don't really know what people are saying about Hyperion. There is a pretty big account that kind of has the market cornered on Hyperion content, but he and the few others that I watched proffered absolutely nothing in terms of analysis or interpretation or the meaning of the themes. All they do is summarize what happens in the book. Well, I read the book, so I don't have any use for that. I want to know what people think it means. I know that there is scholarly writing on Hyperion as well because it is that kind of book, but I've never read any of that either. I do know, apparently, that there's some debate as to whether this story is a sort of cautionary tale written from within or a critical tale written from without. But either way, I don't know what people are saying. So my interpretation could be way off the mark, but I would relate this story specifically to John chapter 20. John chapter 20 is the famous Doubting Thomas story, where St. Thomas refuses to believe the other apostles' testimony that Christ is risen from the dead. And he says that he won't believe unless he can see Christ with his own eyes and touch his wounds with his hands. And so Christ, of course, does appear to St. Thomas, and St. Thomas believes. And Christ says, very famously, "Have you believed me because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." The protagonist of The Priest's Tale is Father Paul Duray, who serves in this far future version of the Catholic Church, which has declined into irrelevance, and from Father Duray's perspective is about to go extinct entirely. The subtitle of the story is The Man Who Cried God, which is obviously a reference to the boy who cried wolf. Father Duray has a special affinity for Saint Teilhard, who is, of course, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and I've never been able to say that name properly. But Desjardins was a Jesuit theologian and scientist in the early 20th century who's well known for writing on evolution and science in an age when the sort of Christian view of creation had seemingly become obsolete. And Teilhard worked to integrate the scientific view of evolution with Catholic theology. Father Duray in The Priest's Tale makes similar attempts to harmonize the scientific discoveries of the 28th century with his faith. He is so desperate to do so and so desperate to sort of revitalize the Catholic Church that he perpetuates a scientific hoax claiming to have found evidence that Christianity was practiced on an alien world prior to humanity's arrival there. When the ruse is discovered, Father Duray is sent to the planet Hyperion as an exile, and there he investigates a native population called the Bikura, who call themselves the 70. Among the 70, he finds what he believes to be exactly such evidence as he had previously faked. The Bikura worship in this sort of impossibly old mountain citadel in front of a giant cross, which they call the cruciform. And so I won't say much more about the plot of The Priest's Tale in an uncharacteristic concern for spoilers. If you haven't read it, you just have to go read it. But how does the story relate to the passage in John's Gospel that I brought up? Well, contrary to what others on YouTube will claim, Father Duray is not a fanatic. He's not someone who is so convicted in the truth of Christianity that he's willing to compromise his morals and cheat and lie to get others to believe it. In fact, no one really does this. If you are convinced of the truth of something, you don't have to coerce other people to believe it. Like, truth will out. If something is true, you certainly don't have to lie in order to get people to believe it. So from a Christian perspective, Father Duray's tragic undoing is not a result of too much faith, right? He's not too fanatical. It's a result of too little faith. And his devotion to Teilhard is an expression of that, because he, meaning Father Duray, is so obsessed with finding an external material confirmation of what should be an interior trust. And for the atheists and the pagans, this is going to sound like pure cope, but this is the Christian view. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. And according to Ancestry.com, which of course means nothing, the name Duray is derived from the French word for hard and means like someone who is hard-hearted or hard-headed or obstinate, by the way, which I find really interesting. I have absolutely no reason to believe that Dan Simmons did that intentionally, but I don't believe that these things are always intentional. We can view the Scholar's Tale from Hyperion through a similar lens as this as well. That story is about a Jew named Saul Weintraub, whose daughter contracts Merlin sickness, which is this disease that makes her age backwards from adulthood. And my recollection of that story, because I haven't read it in a couple of years, but I believe Saul is actually just an atheist, but he goes to live with the kind of Jewish diaspora, which still exists in the 28th century. 700 years from now, the Jews are still in exile. But Saul is obsessed with the story of the binding of Isaac from the book of Genesis, which is, of course, the story when God instructs Abraham to take his son Isaac up Mount Moriah to be sacrificed. Saul is indignant at what he believes to be the injustice of making a man think that he's about to kill his own son. Isaac isn't, of course, actually sacrificed. God steps in at the last moment to stop it. However, from a Jewish perspective, I think Saul's objection is actually pretty reasonable, or pretty understandable at least. This would be a pretty difficult story to swallow, I think, if you are a Jew, because it amounts to nothing more than like an extreme test of loyalty. Of course, viewed in the light of Christ, the story changes completely. And I'm not going to go into all of the different parallels between Christ's crucifixion and the binding of Isaac. There are many of them. They're very easy to find. But once you understand these, the story takes on an entirely new light. It becomes a foreshadowing of the exact sacrifice that God himself was going to make on behalf of all mankind. And so Jews and Muslims lack this perspective. They don't have the resolution to the story. And so I think Saul Weintraub, even from a religious perspective, is a pretty understandable and relatable character. Like he is very sympathetic, and of course, the whole story is incredibly tragic and really well written. And the two priest characters are also very relatable. Father DeRay and Father Hoyt, the other priest, who takes on someone else's burden onto himself in a very Christ-like way. These are all very well-written characters. War in Heaven is a 1930 fantasy thriller by English author Charles Williams. Williams famously was one of the Inklings, along with J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Owen Barfield. War in Heaven is the first of a series of what seem to be loosely connected novels that center around the discovery of and use of Christian artifacts in 1930s England. The first installment is about the discovery of the Holy Grail at a small Anglican parish and the various people or groups that attempt to seize it or defend it. A lot is made of opening lines in novels, and I do think that their importance is a little overstated, but this book does have a really good one. The telephone bell was ringing wildly, but without result, since there was no one in the room but the corpse. So the story begins with a murder, but it isn't a whodunit. We find out pretty quickly that this murder, which takes place in the office of a book publishing company, is related to a forthcoming volume by a scholar named Sir Giles Tumulty, which traces the Holy Grail to a countryside parish called Fardles. The former owner of this publishing company is an occultist named Gregory Persimmons, who, along with some other nefarious characters with whom he is in league, want to keep the location of the Grail secret so they can acquire it for themselves for malevolent purposes. Persimmons, along with the publishers Lionel Rackstraw and Kenneth Mornington, as well as the archdeacon who presides at the Fardles parish and a few others, become embroiled in a struggle over the Grail. And this book is not a mystery. There isn't really a question about who committed the murder or whether or not the Grail is real or whether it's there. It is real. There is a Grail, and it has true power. Persimmons is in league with a group of Satanists who want to use the Grail to corrupt others, beginning with Rackstraw's young boy, Adrian. And so it's a thriller. It's a very thrilling story with truly sinister antagonists. There's high stakes, intrigue, and lots of supernatural and metaphysical exploration. In fact, Williams's depiction of the sort of mystical is the most evocative and vivid that I've ever read. I want to read a passage from a chapter called The Sabbath, where Gregory Persimmons anoints himself in some satanic ointment and undergoes a dark mystical vision. And now he was descending, lower and lower, into a darker and more heavy atmosphere. His intention checked his flight, and it declined almost into stillness. Night was about him, and more than night, a heaviness which was like that felt in a crowd, a pressure and intent expectation of relief. As to the mind of a man in prayer might come sudden reminders of great sanctities in other places and other periods, so now to him came the consciousness, not in detail, but as achievements of far-off masteries of things, multitudinous dedications consummating themselves in that which was already on its way. But that his body was held in a trance by the effect of the ointment, the smell of which had long since become part of his apprehension, he would have turned his head one way or the other to see or speak to those unseen companions. Suddenly there rose within him the sense of a vast and rapid flow, of which he was part, rushing and palpitating with desire. He desired, the heat about his heart grew stronger, to give himself out, to be one with something that should submit to him and from which he should yet draw nourishment, but something beyond imagination, stupendous. He was hungry, but not for food. He was thirsty, but not for drink. He was filled with passion, but not for flesh. He expanded in the rush of an ancient desire. He longed to be married to the whole universe for a bride. His father appeared before him, senile and shivering, his wife bewildered and broken. his son harassed and distressed. These were his marriages, these his bridals. The bridal dance was beginning. They and he and innumerable others were moving to the wild rhythm of that aboriginal longing. Beneath all the little cares and whims of mankind, the tides of that ocean swung, and those who had harnessed them and those who had been destroyed by them were mingled in one victorious catastrophe. His spirit was dancing with his peers, and yet still something in his being held back and was not melted. So those were two paragraphs, two very long paragraphs, obviously, but essentially the whole chapter is like this, and many other scenes in the book are like this as well. And so as the plot unfolds, the broader picture of the nature of the Grail and the nature of the forces involved becomes clearer. The plot is extremely exciting. It's beautifully written, and even the historical, I guess you would say mythological character Prester John becomes involved at one point. Many Dimensions is the follow-up to War in Heaven. I'm unsure if it's supposed to take place before or after War in Heaven. Sir Giles Tumulty appears again in this novel, but there's no reference to any of the events about the Grail or Fardals or the book or anything, at least as far as I remember. But this time, Sir Giles has acquired the crown of Suleiman, aka Solomon, from some Persian nobility. And the crown contains a stone which has the power to transport someone to any time or place, as well as to within someone's mind. The stone is said to be made from the first matter, the stuff from which God fashioned everything. And since it contains all matter within it, it can be divided infinitely without diminution. So you can break a piece off of the stone and the original will be undamaged, and the piece that you broke off will be a whole and identical copy of the original. So naturally, the existence of these stones poses a massive problem for humanity. As soon as they begin to proliferate, everyone could get one at no cost and unlock its power. In that sense, the stakes in Many Dimensions are much higher for mankind as a whole, but the personal stakes seem much less. Most of the book is simply people standing around talking about the stone, what it can do, how significant it is, what should be done about it. There are some similar mystical or metaphysical descriptions as there are in War in Heaven, but they're fewer and they're less awe-inducing, and the plot is much less exciting and the characters are much less interesting. But still, stylistically, it's very well written. It's written in the same kind of style that War in Heaven was written. And the ideas, of course, are very interesting. And so I'm excited to keep reading this series. I guess there are 7 books. I don't know how much they relate to one another, but they're all very short and they're all very easy to read. So I look forward to continuing with this series. The High Crusade is a 1960 science fiction novel by American author Poul. It tells the story of a hostile alien ship which lands in 14th century England and is roundly defeated by the brave English knights under the command of Sir Roger de Tourneville. The Englishmen capture the alien ship and intend to use it to conquer France and to liberate the Holy Land, when their alien prisoner, who is piloting the ship, secretly sends them deep into space towards the nearest alien-settled planet. So Sir Roger is stranded in space on this stolen spacecraft with essentially an entire town of people and their belongings. He has his knights and soldiers, of course, but also women and children and priests and monks and the cattle and livestock and all their belongings. Sir Roger has to fight off the aliens while trying to find a way home, trying to keep morale among his men, and to placate his wife and so forth. The story is told basically as a chronicle by a monk who was on this journey, but it isn't particularly medieval feeling in its style. There is a sort of frame narrative as well, which you totally forget about as you read, until it comes back at the end when there's sort of a twist. I didn't see it coming, at least. The majority of the novel deals with these Englishmen on the alien planet fighting a series of battles against a much larger and much more technologically advanced alien species. The Englishmen overcome the aliens through sort of human ingenuity and creative problem solving. So for instance, they take over this base and have a series of skirmishes with the aliens who set up like a forward operating base nearby, and they end up at a stalemate and begin to retreat. They've captured enemy flyers and want to use them to fly to another base on this planet and steal weapons there, but they know that they'll be detected if they just fly right out of the base. So they take their horses and drag the flyers out of the base to a safe distance and then fly off. After they go, there's another skirmish, and the aliens are about to overwhelm them when a giant explosion, like a sort of blinding nuclear blast, goes off beside the alien base. Now, Sir Roger, up to this point, has been trying to convince the aliens that the English are a much more technologically advanced race than these aliens that they're fighting. And of course, the aliens don't believe them until this explosion goes off. And then they start to search the surrounding area for a type of artillery weapon that could have fired such a large and destructive shell, and they can't find anything. But what has happened is the team that went to go steal the weapons has stolen one of these shells, set up a trebuchet in the woods, and launched the shell with the trebuchet. So the aliens are searching for some large artillery weapon, but actually it's just a big wooden structure in the woods, so they can't find it. So that's the kind of battle tactics that the Englishmen use in their war on the aliens. Ingenuity, subterfuge, and pure human willpower. I was pretty lukewarm on this book for most of the story. It certainly didn't have the kind of mythic pathos that is present throughout all of The Broken Sword by Poul, which I spoke about in my last video. It plays out as basically like a lighthearted space adventure and a cool what-if idea up until basically the very end, when it takes on like a dramatic and a personal turn. The last sort of 10 to 20% of the novel ends up being human versus human instead of human versus alien, and it becomes much more interesting and emotionally gripping, and the finale actually turns the whole thing around. The finale is fantastic. There's also an epilogue which takes place sometime after the main events of the story, which involves the search for the Holy Grail on an alien planet. Sort of similar to the priest's tale, they discover evidence that Christianity exists on this alien planet that humans have never been to before, and they believe that the Holy Grail itself is there on this alien planet, and they go in search of it. It's sort of a self-contained short story, and honestly, it isn't all that engaging. So these were 4 books that I read recently, the last 2 months or so, that I thought could be combined into one video because they had sort of similar themes. Next up will actually be another Poul Anderson novel, which I've already started, and I will continue on with the, I believe it's called the Aspects of Power series, the Charles Williams series. I DNF'd this book. I don't know if you can see it, I'm far away from the camera. The Wizard Knight by Gene Wolfe. I got about halfway through The Knight, which is the first book, and it just was not for me. It had all of the things I disliked about Book of the New Sun and none of the things that I liked, so I just dropped it. I mean, I have it here still. There's still a chance that I might finish it, but I'm not really sure. It is a thick book. I'm not really sure it's worth the time. But if you've read it and you want me to continue on, you think it's worth it, you can drop a comment below. Let me know if you've read any of the 4 books that I talked about here. But, like and subscribe and all of that stuff. You've used YouTube before. You know how all this works.